Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos. Me gustaría darles una calurosa bienvenida a nuestro panel número 4 en el día de hoy sobre economía, seguridad jurídica, estabilidad y desigualdad tras la pandemia. Un tema que incluye muchos tópicos dependiendo del punto de vista que uno lo quiera ver, pero creo que con la calidad de panelistas que nosotros tenemos en la tarde de hoy, vamos a tener una visión mucho más clara desde la perspectiva de varios continentes. Quiero empezar por presentarles a la panelista Miren Chubilla Oliveros, quien es la vicepresidenta de la Junta Directiva de Seguros del Estado. También nosotros tenemos de manera virtual a Katherine Meighan, que es la consejera general del FIDA y miembro del Comité Ejecutivo de Gestión. Lo menciono en inglés porque nos está acompañando de manera virtual, General Counsel of IFAD and a member of the Executive Management Committee. Y también nosotros tenemos que nos está acompañando en la tarde de hoy otra persona de manera virtual que está acompañándonos a nosotros desde los Estados Unidos, quien es León Edward Panetta. Fue el secretario de Defensa de los Estados Unidos del 2011 al 2013 y director de la Agencia Central de Inteligencia CIA del 2009 al 2011. Yo creo que con los nombres que le he dado y para hacer un poco esta plática de la manera más amena posible y permitir que posterior a ella nosotros tengamos la oportunidad de hacer preguntas, si lo tienen a bien, ya sea dentro de los mismos panel o bien del público que nos acompaña de manera presencial y de la manera virtual. Les digo un poco sobre mí. Yo soy diputada de la República de Panamá, fui embajadora de Panamá en el Reino Unido y además pues de profesión soy abogada, así es que yo creo que es un tema muy interesante para que nosotros empecemos pues a tratarlo. Me gustaría, si ustedes me lo permiten, darle la palabra a Katherine, quien nos está acompañando, y nos gustaría pues escuchar su exposición sobre el tema en mención. Gracias.
Thank you so much. It's truly a pleasure to be with you today. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you. I join you from Rome, Italy, where IFAD is based. I'm the Associate Vice President and General Counsel of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD. And it's really a pleasure to be with you representing this organization with an audience so diverse, so caring, and so sensitive and sensitized to really the impact on the economy, legal certainty, stability, and inequality in the aftermath of the pandemic. I was focusing on the word aftermath in the title, looking at events of recent days, and that's something that I want to reflect on as well. I think we do need to step back and have a longer look at the trajectory of the pandemic, because we have to face the fact that actually humanity has made huge leaps in the efforts to combat global poverty over the last 30 years. I work at a poverty reduction agency, part of the UN, but also an international financial institution that finances small-scale farmers and producers in the most rural areas of the developing world in the last mile. And 30 years ago, 1/3 of the world's population, 33% of people, lived below the poverty line. That number in 2020 was reduced from 33% to just 10%. That's a huge leap that together we made going forward in stability and equality and certainty. And then the pandemic hit. This caused the first rise in global poverty in decades. The pandemic pushed nearly 70 million people into extreme poverty, which is making less than $1.90 a day for the household. And it pushed about 130 million people globally into the ranks of the undernourished. And it's true that the impact of the pandemic was far from spread equally. Governments around the world in many of our countries responded by locking down economies to prevent the spread of the virus. But this hurt food supply chains and stifled demand. You know, cutting interest rates, giving tax benefits, and boosting infrastructure spending had positive effects, but helped mainly those who were already empowered. And the pandemic exposed all varieties of divides in the global economy. You know, some people could do jobs from home over Zoom or own stocks or bonds and had government contracts which prospered. But the nearly 3.4 billion people living today in rural areas in the developing world were the hardest hit. And they were already among the very most vulnerable in the world, many losing their livelihoods, access to finance, and sustenance. And that's why I'm so happy to be here today, because I think that with the backdrop in the aftermath of the pandemic, it's very important to bring together the global community to talk about these issues. It's not only a moral imperative, but it's absolutely vital to the future of the global economy. As this marginalized population risks dropping out of the productive workforce, we risk seeing increased inequality, increased migration, and increased stresses on all the world. Right now, nearly 63% of the world's poorest people work in agriculture. At IFAD, we refer to this, the majority on small farms in rural areas, as the last mile, or the last kilometer, if you like, depending on where you sit, if you use miles or kilometers. These people are already coping with the impacts of climate change, disease outbreaks, inequality, economic downturn. And at IFAD, as a UN agency, as well as an international financial institution, with the specific mandate to invest in rural agriculture, we do feel that there's much more work to be done than in 2020 before the pandemic. I strongly believe that these small farmers who produce about half of the world's food are the ones who are most at risk after the pandemic. And those who put food on our tables should not have to go to bed hungry at night. Their children should not have to suffer malnutrition or starvation. And so it's very important we find innovative solutions to boost these livelihoods. Let me share with you a few just kind of examples from IFAD and our work. So casting my mind back to February 2020, the situation here in Italy started to be incredibly serious. I'm sure you all saw it on the news, you know, from your various countries. We locked down almost overnight in a very serious lockdown because no one understood how the pandemic was progressing and spreading, with many deaths here in Italy. We actually used a lot of this knowledge from what happened here and working with our partner countries in the developing world to help advise them on things that we had done wrong initially, things on the policy front as well as on the food and program front. So on the policy front, for example, we advise many governments in the developing world, if writing lockdown laws, to be sure to include agricultural exemptions so that farmers could get food on the roads to markets and get that to consumers. That was a problem that we had here. Similarly, on the production level, we provided at IFAD support packages in many different countries of seeds and fertilizers and inputs that are needed, because the planting season waits for no one. If you don't have the materials to plant and the seeds, you've missed it. So this was very important that it soon became clear that the scale of the crisis called for us to do a lot more. And so here we launched in April 2020 a rural poor stimulus facility that was basically a funding mechanism to support the most poor, vulnerable, and marginalized people in rural economies so that they were not thrown into a cycle, a vicious cycle of poverty from the COVID situation. And I'm very proud, looking back at last year alone, that these projects reached more than 1.6 million beneficiaries across the globe. Now, one of the other main areas, you know, we talk about when we look at poverty is also climate. We just finished COP26 in Glasgow, and I'm sure many of those in the audience were following climate adaptation, new technology.
Muchísimas gracias, Katherine, por esa descripción tan extensa sobre lo que realmente significa parte de la agencia de que ella dirige. Estaba teniendo un poquito de problemas con la conexión, pero nosotros logramos entender lo más importante que ella nos quiso dar a conocer hoy. Me gustaría cederle ahora la palabra al señor Leon Edward Panetta de los Estados Unidos, quien fue secretario de Defensa y además director de la Agencia de Inteligencia. Adelante.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to join you in this important discussion about the impact of COVID on our economy, on legal certainty, on stability, on inequality, and where our country and where the world is headed as a result of this severe pandemic. I'm honored to have this opportunity, particularly to address the World Law Congress. I commend you for your efforts to try to promote a respect for international law and for the rule of law. It is one of the most important challenges, I believe, today, is to stress how important it is that all of us, regardless of country, have to abide by a set of international rules and laws that are critical to our ability not only to work together, but to be able to respect one another as we try to find answers to the challenges we're facing. You're also operating, as I understand, from Colombia, and I want to pay my respects to all of those in Colombia as both Director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense. I had the opportunity to work with a number of my counterparts in Colombia, and I want to extend my deepest regards to all of them and to commend them for the great work that has been done with regards to trying to establish a better society in Colombia. And lastly, I'm honored because I believe that what this organization is trying to do is to address global issues. We live at a time when this is truly a global world, in the sense that we are confronting global challenges, not only to our planet, but to the people on our planet. And for that reason, I think it's incredibly important for people to come together and try to develop comprehensive approaches to dealing to these challenges. Too often, we now have an approach where every country, every part of the world deals with these challenges on its own. And the problem is that rather than working together to develop a comprehensive global approach to these issues, we tend to look inward and try to just deal with our own challenges. And while I understand that, I think we do have to recognize that if we are going to confront these issues, we simply do have to work together and try to develop comprehensive approaches. Let me speak specifically to the impact with regards to this pandemic in terms of the United States and our country, because I think what has happened here reflects a great deal of what's happened elsewhere in the world. In many ways, look, this has been the year from hell. We've not only had to confront COVID, and here in this country, we're looking at 800,000 who will die as a result of COVID. It's a huge number of people who have died as a result of this worldwide pandemic, something I thought we would never experience. But in addition to the lives that have been lost, COVID had a huge impact on our economy, because when it happened, we basically shut down our economy, shut down a lot of businesses, shut down a lot of jobs, and created virtually a recession comparable to the Great Depression that we confronted in the early 30s, with a lot of people losing their jobs and their opportunities. That impact both COVID and what happened in our economy also increased the inequality in our society. America was a society in which we had increased the division between the poor and the wealthy in our society and created even a greater gap between those two. And what COVID did was it increased that inequality in our society because families, particularly families that were not wealthy, had to confront the challenge of what to do in the face of losing their job, in the face of losing their income, in the face of not being able to pay their rents and be able to survive. So without question, it increased the inequality here in America. And in addition to that, when I talk about the year from hell, climate change has produced a lot of impacts within our own country. Here in California, where I live, we've had significant wildfires for these last 2 years. Wildfires that have consumed a great part of the state and have been much more difficult to contain because of the impact of climate change. We're also now experiencing a severe drought in California, which is also the consequence of climate change. So that too is impacting on the quality of life in our country, and I'm sure that's true elsewhere. And lastly, I do have to mention the fact that here in our country, we are now seeing greater polarization in the American society than we've seen in a long time. There is a division, a divide in the American society in which either because of fears or angers or the consequences of political differences, that polarization has impacted on both the quality of our democracy, but it also resulted in an attack that we saw on January 6th, where a mob literally took over the United States Capitol and brought our democracy to a halt. So all of that has occurred, and all of that represents challenges to our country, particularly with regards to how our democracy functions. I have said that in my 50 years of public life, I have seen Washington at its best and Washington at its worst. The reality is I've seen Washington work, where Republicans and Democrats work together to govern. And for all of the democracies in the world, it is critical, if democracies are to survive, that there be a recognition that there has to be a respect for one another, the willingness to listen to one another, and the ability to then work together to find consensus. Unfortunately, Washington now, for a period of time, has in many ways been dysfunctional because of those differences. And the result of all of this is that it creates greater legal uncertainty rather than legal certainty about what is exactly happening. People who decide to distort the law and distort the facts are increasing in America today. And that is creating even greater legal uncertainty about the direction of our country. So I think we are living at a time when I think it is really important that we understand that if we're to deal with these global challenges that we're facing, if we are to deal with challenges like COVID and a worldwide pandemic, if we are to deal with climate change, if we're to deal with the problems of poverty and inequality, it is absolutely essential that we have a comprehensive approach of nations working together to develop strategies in order to confront those issues. That is certainly true when it comes to the security of our countries. As Secretary of Defense, if we are to confront the security problems we are facing, we simply must work together. And I think the same thing is true with regards to the challenge of global threats that affect all people on Earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been such an honor, Mr. Panetta, to have you from California. With all your experience, I think, as Secretary of Defense and then the CIA, I think we can all understand what exactly where we are at right now. And I think I take few things from what you said, and the most important is that we have to face this together, because the pandemic, as you just described it, the pandemic from health will have a before and after. As you know, I'm from Panama, and we have had very much difficulties on this. And from the Assembly, we have tried to promote laws and really generate more development of the economy, and hasn't been easy, and it's not going to be easy, and we're not even sure if the pandemic has ended, or we are in a post-pandemic period, or we are still in a pandemic with this new variant. So thank you very much, and we feel really honored for you to have joined us from California. Nuestra próxima panelista, me honra en presentar a Meighan Villa Oliveros, quien es la vicepresidenta de la Junta Directiva de Seguros del Estado. Bienvenida y adelante.
Gracias. Muchas gracias. Lo primero, pues estamos encantados como Seguros del Estado y también como Mutua Madrileña, que entró en el capital hace aproximadamente 2 años, de participar. Probablemente muchos de ustedes se estarán preguntando que aseguradoras, qué papel tenemos en esta fase del post-COVID. O bueno, esperemos que sea post-COVID, que todavía podemos tener aquí alguna variante que nos dé guerra. Pues viendo y escuchando a mis compañeros en el panel, la verdad es que viendo lo que ha sufrido el mundo con el COVID, probablemente es un momento para que el sector asegurador pues podamos ser un apoyo muchísimo mayor del que ya hemos venido siendo en el pasado. Con la caída del PIB, con el aumento del paro, con la desaparición de empresas. Yo soy española y tengo que decir que el tejido empresarial español, que está muy concentrado en las pymes, ha sufrido muchísimo. Y por eso, además de otras cosas, es por lo que me gustaría compartir con ustedes en estos minutos el porqué el seguro y la regulación del seguro y cómo puede apoyar en unos momentos tan críticos que han afectado pues, a todo el mundo, cosa que no sufríamos probablemente desde hace muchísimos años, o por grandes conflictos bélicos o por grandes pandemias, como fue también la mal llamada gripe española, que la verdad es que arrasó Europa. Dicho esto, ¿por qué el seguro tiene un papel estabilizador en las democracias y sobre todo en periodos post-crisis globales? El seguro lo que hace es proteger fundamentalmente el patrimonio de la clase media, y la clase media es el mejor garante de dar sostenibilidad en cualquier circunstancia, tanto desde un punto de vista político como también desde un punto de vista pues de una situación como la que estamos viviendo ahora. Esa estabilidad de la clase media es fundamental para que la democracia progrese y, sobre todo, pues como decía nuestro último panelista, en estos momentos en el que todos tenemos que estar unidos, el que pueda tener estabilidad es fundamental. Y cómo el seguro puede suponer una estabilidad tanto para la clase media, en general para todo el mundo, pero para la clase media especialmente, y también para las empresas. Pues, por ejemplo, el seguro de vida es un seguro que protege tanto el ahorro futuro como también la vida. La falta, a lo mejor, de un familiar, que puede ser el aportador principal en una familia, pues ayuda muchísimo. El seguro de auto y hogar. ¿Cuáles son las dos principales inversiones que hace una familia? Pues probablemente su casa y su coche. El tener protegido lo que supone el mayor porcentaje de patrimonio de un hogar, pues es fundamental. En este país, Seguros del Estado, compañía de la que me honra ser vicepresidenta de la Junta Directiva, somos líderes en este seguro. Y se está trabajando muchísimo, y surgió también para dar una protección a esa clase media, se está trabajando muchísimo con los reguladores para dar un paso más a ese seguro y llevarlo a un seguro de responsabilidad civil general, lo cual pues todavía protege más. Adicionalmente, como decía, el seguro de hogar, la vivienda es fundamental, la pérdida total y más hemos hablado del coronavirus, pero las catástrofes naturales cada vez son mayores, cada vez tenemos más terremotos, inundaciones, todo tipo de catástrofe que la verdad es que ayuda muchísimo en el momento de esa pérdida. Adicionalmente, como decía, el tener un marco jurídico, somos un sector regulado en todo el mundo, el sector asegurador, pero el tener un marco jurídico que dé soporte a esa regulación, que proteja también los balances de las compañías. Muchas veces es doloroso y hay que hacer grandes inversiones, pero finalmente protege, como decía, a ese individuo y a esas empresas. Desde el punto de vista de las empresas, por ejemplo, el seguro, que es súper importante en Colombia, el seguro de cumplimiento, Seguros del Estado, que también pues viene trabajando hace más de 50 años y que es líder del sector, protege muchísimo las relaciones, el tejido empresarial y ayuda muchísimo al desarrollo de la economía. Con lo cual, desde el punto de vista que se mire, el tener los bienes asegurados, el generar esa cultura aseguradora, que yo sé que se está haciendo un gran esfuerzo, tanto desde el gobierno colombiano como desde las instituciones que participamos en el seguro, es fundamental para conseguir que, bueno, pues que en un periodo como este, en el que la salud, que es probablemente el bien más cuidado y más importante para las personas, pues pueda extenderse a mucho más número de personas y con todo eso se pueda seguir progresando. Con lo cual, no quiero extenderme muchísimo más. Creo que el papel del sector asegurador, y la verdad es que Colombia tiene un fuerte sector asegurador y en el mundo tenemos también el reaseguro, que es el que nos protege a las compañías de seguros en este tipo de eventos, pues son un soporte para que de verdad exista esa capacidad más rápida de sobreponernos a este tipo de pandemias o, en este caso, el COVID o cualquier otro tipo de problema climatológico. Muchísimas gracias y encantados de estar aquí con vosotros.
Muchas gracias, Mirenchu, por esa tan didáctica intervención que has tenido, porque en unas palabras muy simples has dicho mucho sobre lo que realmente todos nos preocupa, que es la estabilidad, o sea, estar seguro. Y realmente yo creo que es muy atinado que tu intervención haya sido justo al final, después de haber escuchado a los dos que tenemos en línea, que son Katherine y, por supuesto, el exsecretario de Defensa, Panetta, quien entiendo que ambos todavía nos están acompañando. Yo, antes de elaborar alguna pregunta, si todavía están de manera virtual, quisiera decirles un poco que yo me quedo con la idea, y siempre he sido vocera de la misma en la Asamblea Nacional de Panamá, que es, si en un país no existe seguridad jurídica, Estado de Derecho, es sumamente difícil salir a vender tu país para generar inversión. Yo creo que es un aspecto en el que los gobernantes de distintos países, yo en este caso particular me voy a referir a Panamá, tenemos que tomar mucho en cuenta, porque en este momento estamos compitiendo muchos países en salir a vender y que las personas vengan e inviertan en tu país, pero realmente aquel inversionista siempre se va a asegurar de que en el país en que vaya a poner su dinero sea un país estable y que no sea cambiante por los vaivenes políticos cada 5 años y cada 4 años, y eso pues nosotros hemos sido conscientes. Dentro de la Asamblea Nacional de Panamá, el gobierno, desde que se decretó la pandemia, promulgó varias leyes. Una de ellas fue particularmente una iniciativa mía propia, que fue incentivar a aquellas personas que le llamamos nómadas digitales. Nómadas digitales son aquellos pequeños empresarios, no tiene que ser gran capital, que trabajan desde su computadora, que vienen al país, se instalan y no necesariamente la relación laboral jurídica es con el país, sino que ya tienen su empleo y lo pueden hacer de cualquier parte del mundo. Esto, ¿con qué objetivo? Muy sencillo, para que vengan al país. Nosotros le llamamos en español teletrabajo, en inglés es digital nomads, vienen al país, se conectan virtualmente a su computadora y realmente ellos están generando renta de apartamentos, compra de alimentación y tantas otras cosas, y en el caso de Panamá particularmente la atracción del turismo, que consideramos como pieza fundamental del movimiento de una economía que, como todos ustedes saben, es una economía eminentemente de servicios, tenemos el canal de Panamá, tenemos un centro financiero muy importante y por supuesto el centro logístico con las zonas libres de ambos lados del Pacífico y del Atlántico. Quería dejarles pues un poco esa idea de Panamá. No sé si aquí los que están en los controles está todavía Katherine online, pero si está, me gustaría mucho preguntarle a ella un poco el tema sobre el fondo del cual ella es consejera general, que es el Fondo de Agricultura, cómo ella ve el futuro, y no sé si lo tenga que decir en inglés o hay traductores simultáneos, pero how, Meighan, do you see the future of agriculture, specifically from the fund that you are General Counsel of and Executive Management Committee? And I ask this question because agriculture, for example, in Panama, never ended. This was the people that never ended working and were the people that were feeding all of us during the 9 years of lockdown. So I would like to hear from you, if possible, how do you see the future of agriculture, not only in the United States, but also in the region?
Thank you so much for the excellent questions. I apologize, our internet here in Rome is going in and out because we have a very big rainstorm going on outside. We see small-scale farmers and producers, those who take the food and process it, bring it to market, etc., as absolutely critical. Small farmers, as I had mentioned earlier, produce about 50% of the food in the world. And it's a huge amount of food, and they were actually among those most resilient in the pandemic in terms of being able to keep on doing their work, provided that they had the inputs, the seeds, the fertilizers, etc. And in many of our countries that we work in about 100 countries globally, among the across the developing world. The laws were really well written for the pandemic to allow this agriculture to continue. As I mentioned, many of the laws had agriculture exemptions so that farmers could continue to bring the food to market, that intermediaries could go to market. We also saw a high uptake of technology. So, for example, the use by very small farmers in rural areas of putting on their cell phones almost as a wholesaler the goods that were available so that people could come to them and get the food. We saw a big uptake in the use of technology also, for example, in global remittances that are funds sent usually from wealthier countries by the diaspora in those countries back home. And there was a huge increase in this, and this actually caused a spike in something that we've been working on a long time, which is more gender equal uptake of finance among small farmers. So because, you know, the bricks and mortar banks were shut in many cases, many people abroad from different countries started sending more money back using remittances and digital technology. And so more women who had not previously in these rural communities been using banking, finance, insurance, started using it through kind of leapfrogging over traditional bricks and mortar banks into digital finance on their phones to get money from abroad to be able to buy small seeds and inputs. The people we work with, of course, are really the most vulnerable and marginalized. So these are generally households making $2 or less a day in income, but yet producing so much to really feed the world. So while the pandemic, I think, you know, caused a lot of huge challenges and continues to do so, we also saw some kind of surprising things looking at the pandemic. Some very resilient ways for businesses to continue, communities coming together, the increase in the use of digital finance on phones, increased uptaking among women in these segments. And so those were some very positive things. I think another thing we really focused on, you know, you talked about global nomads coming back to Panama to work. Yes, we saw that in many of our countries. In terms of the rural population, one thing we were really also focused on is making sure that farmers continued to farm in the rural areas, and there wasn't a huge reverse migration from the farms to the cities because they weren't able to work and get food and provide. So really to help enable the rural farmers to use more technology, have the right inputs to stay there and keep producing food, and not cause even different and other problems migrating to cities or further afield. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Katherine. No, indeed, it's really clear, and thank you for that expand and that understanding on what we wanted to learn from you. I'd like to know from Mr. Panetta, he mentioned when he was speaking about the fact that the inequality was broadened or was really big during this whole year of the pandemic. I don't know if it's fair to ask if you see that from your background, that decreasing in the short, near future, or do you see that that gap will continue expanding?
Thank you for the question. That has been one of the great challenges that we have been trying to confront in our society. There was, I think, a sense coming out of World War II that as a result of the ability to provide jobs to all of our forces that were coming back home, the GI Bill, which gave them funds for the ability to get an education and get housing, that it began to expand the middle class in our country and really created a period where Americans, I think, because of the jobs they were getting, whether it was in industries of one kind or another, or the ability to get an education and move into the professions, that this country really had a very broad middle class. As a result of some of the changes that have taken place in the last, I would say, 15 to 20 years, there has been a tremendous amount of incentives for people at the upper end to increase their investments, increase their status. The stock market has exploded in this country in terms of the returns that have been provided. But at the same time, we were losing jobs, and people who had established jobs, whether it was in the automobile industry or other industries, began to lose those jobs as those industries either shut down or moved to other countries. And so the divide began to increase. And politically, there really was not a response to what was happening. For the first time, with President Biden, he focused on the need to try to not only increase jobs, but also deal with the inequities of working families with regards to child care, with regards to how you educate your children, with regards to health care, with regards to housing, and a number of other areas. And included provisions in the bill called Build Back America to try to provide greater relief to those working families. We were able in this country, because it was a bipartisan effort, to pass an infrastructure bill. That infrastructure bill provided about $1.7 trillion in order to support improvements in infrastructure. Very important to our economy, to be able to restore highways, to restore bridges, to restore transportation, to provide greater internet coverage within the country, it really did try to develop the kind of support system we need for infrastructure in being able to maintain a strong economy. That passed, it was signed into law, and hopefully those funds will begin to help. The Build Back America bill, Build Back Better, passed the House but is now in the Senate and is facing some difficult challenges. If that bill were to pass, I think the sense is, and by the way, it's supported by a vast majority of Americans in our country. If it does pass, it will provide the kind of support system that can help families that are working families be able not only to take care of their children and educate their children, but be able to get the kind of housing and support with tax credits for children, get the kind of support that will, I think, improve the inequality situation in America. So my answer to your question is that should that bill be able to pass, I think that we will begin to see some impact on the inequality that has developed over the last few years.
Hello. Thank you very much. That was really a broad explanation, and at the end you summarize it, so it's really clear. Bueno, yo creo que hemos escuchado de parte de todos los panelistas. Me gustaría abrir un poco hacia alguna persona dentro del público. ¿Tiene alguna pregunta? Alguno de los panelistas, tanto los que están virtuales como los que estamos aquí físicamente. Con muchísimo gusto nos gustaría atenderlas. Aquí, por favor, el micrófono.
Gracias. Para la doctora Mirenchu, sí. Doctora Mirenchu, quería saber cuál era la posición que de pronto se ha asumido desde los órganos de dirección, porque siempre hemos conocido, bueno, particularmente trabajo para una empresa privada, que es tomador de muchas pólizas pues, con seguros del Estado por el tema de la contratación estatal, pero sí es bueno como conocer desde los órganos de dirección qué se ha pensado a futuro respecto de los amparos frente a riesgos como la pandemia. Es decir, cuál es su visión, porque pues yo creo que lo que el COVID nos ha demostrado es que lo único certero es que no hay certeza. Entonces, ¿cuál es la visión de ustedes como empresa consolidada en el país hacia futuro y frente a ese amparo, a ese riesgo en particular? Gracias.
Pues muchas gracias por tu pregunta. Mira, en Seguros tenemos una máxima que es muy difícil que surjan riesgos nuevos, es verdad, o sea, es dificilísimo. En el fondo el COVID no ha sido un riesgo nuevo, el riesgo es la enfermedad, pero sí que ha sido un cúmulo de riesgos nuevos, porque es muy difícil que se te acumule el riesgo propio del individuo, el riesgo de la enfermedad de morir, más el riesgo de no poder vender, de no poder funcionar, de la propia empresa, más el riesgo de todo un país paralizado o todo el mundo paralizado, que es lo que ha ocurrido con el COVID. Entonces, ese cúmulo de riesgos sí que es probablemente una forma de afrontar ese riesgo nuevo. Nosotros desde la compañía tenemos la preocupación y estamos en la revisión de buscar fórmulas que no cabe duda, como decía antes, tendremos que trabajar con los reaseguradores. Una compañía únicamente es imposible que haga frente sola, porque es imposible, no hay capital en el mundo para soportar esto, pero sí estamos trabajando para buscar fórmulas que permitan el poder, como decías, el poder ver qué amparos tienen sentido de cara a prevenir lo que pueda volver a venir. En este momento, pues, ojalá salgamos ya de esta terrible crisis sanitaria en todo el mundo, pero puede venir otra. Esto, si hemos aprendido algo, es que hay cosas nuevas que pueden venir y que pueden afectar a todo el mundo de una manera que nunca nos podíamos haber pensado. Con lo cual, respondiendo a tu pregunta, sí, estamos dándole vueltas a ver de qué forma podemos ayudar a nuestros clientes a la hora de cubrir en situaciones como son estas extremas, digamos, esas garantías que puedan ayudarles en el momento o luego posteriormente a recuperar. Pero como te digo, tiene que ser, decíamos antes que el COVID es un tema mundial, creo que lo comentábamos antes, lo comentaba antes, pues te digo esto lo mismo, esto es un tema mundial, o sea, si al final no hay una cobertura de reaseguro, no hay una empresa que pueda aguantar esto. Pero como nosotros, hay también otras empresas que están con esa preocupación. Y la verdad es que la realidad objetiva es que durante el COVID pues se ha intentado ayudar a, no hablo solo de Seguros del Estado, en general del sector asegurador, y nosotros en España también lo hemos hecho, ayudar a las empresas que estaban trabajando con nosotros, o bien como proveedores o bien como clientes, a la hora de poder pasarlo. Con lo cual, claro que somos muy sensibles y estamos estudiando las fórmulas. Muchas gracias por tu pregunta.
Gracias, Mirencho. Yo creo que ha cerrado con broche de oro este panel y me siento muy honrada porque yo creo que los panelistas han dado sus puntos de vista, tanto en el tema de la agricultura, Katherine, por supuesto la experiencia del secretario de Defensa, ex secretario de Defensa y ex director de la CIA, y acá el punto de vista del seguro, y acá mi persona pues como Latinoamérica y Panamá. Así que no me queda más que agradecerles muchísimo su presencia y me gustaría que le dieran un aplauso aquí a todos los panelistas. Gracias.